Hi everyone, I'd like to welcome you to our very first episode of the Change Network podcast. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Joe Brown. I work for a business called Next Ventures. We're a technology and transformation improvement agency. I head up the change and transformation desk here. So I'm actually very pleased to introduce Melanie Franklin, who's very kindly agreed to give us some of her very valuable time this morning to give some insight into why change is relevant for all, for every business, for every leader. So Mel, it'd be fantastic if you could just give us a bit of insight as to, first of all, your background and what you're doing now, really, and then we can kick off.
Well, I've been doing change and transformation for about 30 years. I was heading up project and program management for several of the investment banks. I started as a business analyst. I became a project manager, program manager, and that's how I headed up the project and program management function. And then I moved into transformational change because large scale programs were actually sort of changing organizations. So what I do now is I work alongside boards in various different organizations around the world, and I am there to support them on their change journey. Part of that is about building up the capability for change that others have in the organization. So it is all about upskilling them, working out what it is we need them to know, trying to put some of that across in a very persuasive way. I've written a number of textbooks on change and transformation. I'm the chief examiner of the Agile Change Agent certification from APMG International. I'm co-leading the Change Management Institute in the UK, and I also head up a couple of thought leadership panels around the world on the direction of change leadership, change building capabilities.
Fantastic. So you're quite a busy lady then.
Yeah.
But it's fantastic that we've got you on this podcast for our first episode. As I say, you've not only got that background in the hands-on actual delivery of transformation projects, but you've also got the expertise from a thought leadership perspective. You've done authored books and you do the Change Management Institute as well. So we're really grateful to have you on here, and I'm sure that both of our networks are going to find a lot of value from listening to this today. So thank you. Yeah. So the first question I had is one of the kind of key topics that I've been speaking to leaders about at the moment, which is essentially that when lockdown first came about, businesses obviously put on hold lots and lots of different transformation programs that they felt were going to struggle to deliver, in a remote working scenario, basically. So it's at the position now where businesses have got this backlog of projects to deliver, not only ones that have been put on hold, but also projects that they need to do now in response to COVID. So what kind of changes would you advise businesses to prioritize in a situation like this?
Well, I don't advise them to prioritize anything. I am definitely going to be the one that helps them make that happen. But what I am seeing in terms of their prioritization is streamlining, automation, simplification of processes. It's all about the cost cutting that many organizations feel they need to do, but also a recognition that when they had to get out of their offices and everybody had to start working from home, it really was a sort of sharp reminder that perhaps we need to be a little bit slicker in the way that we do things, and messing about with lots of bits of paper and having lots of data entry by our staff isn't necessarily the cleverest way we can do things. So I think coming into September, after the whatever summer break people are going to have, I think there is a real move towards a good tidy up. There's certainly been a move out of the office. Let's try and get things done, and people have done tremendously well on that. There's been a great deal of productivity, but the restructurings, I think, will go further. It isn't just the automation. I think that will lead to a revamp of the target operating model for some organisations, particularly having had the shock of, well, we've furloughed a number of staff and actually we're living without them, which I think is a big concern for those who've been furloughed, and the decision on who to return back to the office, or in fact return back to the workspace. So I think a restructuring is likely to be a part of whatever happens coming up in the next couple of months.
Yeah, I suppose what you mentioned about kind of tidying up there is quite important. I feel like a lot of businesses at the moment are really thinking about, okay, what is actually adding value right now to our business, and then kind of taking out everything that doesn't fall in that category. So obviously, you're suggesting that a lot of businesses at the moment are doing the streamlining of processes, the automation, and do you think that should be a focus for organisations to kind of look at their processes and streamline it at the moment, or do you think it depends on the business?
Well, it definitely depends on the business, but I think if you look back at other recessions, so if we look back at 2008 to 2011, one of the discussions I had in a boardroom about 8 weeks ago was exactly this point, which was that your customers might not be in a position to pay for excess amounts of things. So in terms of they want value for money, unless you streamline, unless you get a grip on your own cost base, can you genuinely deliver that value for money? That doesn't say that customers don't still want innovation, because they do, but I think we have to recognize that perhaps when it comes to recessionary times, it is about being slicker in terms of what you deliver, knowing what your costs are, keeping an eye on eradicating those costs. So it's almost like the lean mentality is going to drive, I think, a number of changes that are coming out.
Yeah, absolutely. So kind of following on from that, then I spoke to a CIO just yesterday, actually, who mentioned that business leaders, especially in crisis, but often in more normal circumstances, will adopt quite a rushed, quite a forceful approach to delivering transformation, and kind of almost ignore the change management piece and people piece. So would you say that that's something that can work? And also, what would you say are the risks of doing something like that?
Well, I certainly understand where the CIO is coming from, because I think a number of senior executives have had this idea that, well, we made this change happen. We didn't really manage it. We didn't really plan it. It just happened overnight and we've been successful. So we're now brilliant at change. And I think we're forgetting the fundamental, which is that there is a huge driver for the changes that took place around lockdown, which everybody understood. So if you like, the urgency of the change was not in question. And I think you can certainly do that, but you can't manufacture that for every single change. So you don't confuse the two situations. These changes around lockdown were driven by a very specific set of national or international circumstances that everybody was getting played to them on the news every night. We had politicians who were doing daily briefings that created a sense of much wider social urgency to this. Now, that isn't the case if you've decided that you're going to change your target operating model, or that you've decided that you want to put in some kind of platform that's going to streamline the amount of data entry in your organization. So I think we would be naive to think that the same sense of urgency applies. And that I think half my job is about how do I help people find a reason to change. With this one, I didn't have to. But with everything else, that becomes the sort of the starting point of, do people feel that the change is valuable, worthwhile, makes sense to them? Because why would they put their effort and their energy to something that they think is actually the wrong direction? So I don't think that element of change management has altered in any way. That when it comes to organizational change, that's what many of us in change management do. We help people find their motivation for making the change happen. And I think that's still an essential part.
Okay, cool. So, I mean, on the risk side of that, then, so if a business does decide in a normal circumstance, let's say, to force change on people, and I think you mentioned to me the other day to do change to people rather than to do it with them. So, what would you say are the risks of doing that?
I think there's a financial risk that should capture everybody in the boardroom's attention, which is that we will be paying for change. We commission tangible change. It might be an IT system, for example, where we have decided to procure a platform and we're going to implement it. And of course, the reasons are very sound, that we believe that we can take a lot of steps out of our process, that we can start redeploying people to other more value-added tasks. So lots of good reasons for the business case for that change, if you like. But it is predicated on the fact that that system will go into use. It will become the new norm. And of course, the risk of not getting people on board with the change, not getting people involved, is that they don't use the new platform. They carry on with their Excel spreadsheets. They carry on with inputting their data, and they carry on spending their time not doing the value added activities. So the organization doesn't get the return on investment it was expecting, not at the level it was expecting and not at the speed it was expecting it. So it might dribble over the next couple of years and get some kind of improvement, but it certainly won't be what they were aiming for. So I think there's the financial risk. So change management really is a value added task, because what it's doing is it's a risk mitigation strategy. It mitigates the risk that you won't get the anticipated return on investment. The other risk mitigation action that comes out of effective change management is that we actually protect our staff from spending their time on things that perhaps we don't want them spending their time on. Chiefly, having an exit strategy. Because when people are fearful of change, when people are worried about what's going to happen, then they start looking at other jobs, they start looking at other careers, they start looking at doing something else in their lives because they think, well, it's inevitable, I'm going to lose my job, I might as well. Or they start down the path of feeling incredibly stressed. So it becomes a mental health issue, which is a risk for organisations. Of course, it's a risk to productivity because they then take time out, they then take sick leave. So I think there is something around the human cost of change if we don't do it well. There's also the immediate financial cost of not doing it well.
Yeah, absolutely. And would you say, obviously, because obviously one of the biggest challenges in change management, often, obviously dependent on the organisation, is change fatigue. Would you say that kind of forcing change on an organisation is going to kind of enhance that effect? Or would you say that that's not going to change?
Well, I think all organisations are now getting to a crisis point, in that the amount of change, the volume of change that organisations are experiencing it's huge, it's unprecedented, and it's not slowing down. And this is not just the COVID crisis. This is to do with new technology. It's to do with socio-political changes. It's to do with regulatory changes and demanding customers who want greater pace of innovation all of the time and who are constantly comparing their experience with one company with their experience of another and then going, why aren't you doing this for me? So there's a huge push towards what it is we're actually sort of trying to deliver. In my own work, I think that one of the most depressing things is when I know that people are becoming overwhelmed, they're becoming fatigued by change, and they're sort of saying, please, can you stop the change? And I'm going, no, I can't, because there's an awful lot of change that organisations are not choosing to implement. They are actually the takers from the marketplace. They really don't have a choice. So this idea that please stop the waves hitting the beach, the King Canute defence, it doesn't work. And I spend a lot of my time working through strategies with organisations about how they can better deal with change fatigue. The most important strategy that underpins that is that people don't feel that their organisation has got a change here, a change there, a change there, a change there, that they're going off at tangents all of the time. That what we actually have to work on is that the change is a cohesive picture, and that the next thing I'm asking you to do actually follows through on something I've already asked you to do, and it fits into something that's coming up next. So it's almost a continuous flow. But that takes real talent to be able to do that, and really quite a lot of hard work to knit the story together. So I think it's an important thing for reducing stress, but it's an important thing that is hard to achieve.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you mentioned you mentioned the word story there, which was something I was just about to say. Is, I guess, kind of bringing them in on that story, and making sure that it has a beginning, a middle, and an end, so that everyone knows where they stand at any one point, I suppose. Yeah, that's really good insight. Cool. So, I mean, a lot of businesses that I speak to, they well, in fact, most businesses use very contractor-heavy teams when they're delivering change. So, obviously, we were talking about kind of cost and how to reduce that. So, what would you say about is it effective to have a contractor-heavy team, or would you suggest organisations build more of a kind of in-house capability?
I think what's happening is that organisations are deciding to build an in-house capability, not because there's anything wrong with contractor-heavy teams. In fact, bringing in talented contractors to help make a change happen is really important. They bring an amazing set of new skills to the organisation. But the problem that organizations are now starting to realize, and I think this is something that is a product of where we are now in terms of the volume of change. So I think this is something that's now starting to emerge, is that organizations are now realizing that it doesn't matter how many people or how many consultancies they turn to help them with their change agenda. They actually need the in-house capability for two key reasons. Number one, the volume of change is such that there is absolutely no way that they can employ as many contractors as they have ideas and ambitions. So they absolutely can't staff from externally the huge amount of change they've got going. And secondly, of course, that you actually want a capability that for your organization, change is nothing special. It's normal. We're really good at changing direction, putting in new systems, new processes, launching new products and services. This should be a capability that the organization has. And I am really starting to see over the last couple of years, there's been quite a shift. Those organizations that kind of get change management. And if you'd asked me a few years ago, an example of how they got change management would have been that they had a center of excellence, a sort of central team. They had a change management sort of method or framework. They had lots of templates, and they had lots of sort of in-house resources, sort of a central team of change managers, often contractors to be fair, who they would lend out to various sort of projects and programs. Now that center of excellence is becoming something completely different, which is that it's becoming the owner, the voice of change management, but its job is how do you develop the skills for change in every role, at every level within the organization. So that's the really quite demanding thing. And I'm seeing that shift. It started a few years ago, and it's now becoming something very, very common, that this is how we now behave. So you might be a finance manager, you might be somewhere in marketing, but you are expected to actually be able to understand how to move from this way of working to this way of working, that you can lead yourself, you can lead your own team, you can lead your peers from one to the other. It's now starting to become a standard skill set. So when you ask me about change is sort of something that's relevant for every role, I couldn't agree more, because I think that that's what I'm starting to see as a reality. Evidence that organizations are starting to do this on a more organized basis is that it's now the norm for organizations to be setting up agent networks, change agent, change champions, change advisors, change ambassadors, you name it. The names are out there. I did a webinar last week in the US that had over 500 people registered for it in a very short space of time. It was all about building a change agent network. And the number of questions, I got 5 pages of questions in the first few days of registration when I said, pose your questions and I'll seek to answer them on the webinar. And that was an indication of just how many organizations are now trying to do this as part of the democratization, really. Change management is not a skill for a specific small group of people over here. It's great if you've got amazing experts in psychology, behavioral economics, neuroscience, who can really help with change. But over here, you need this huge volume. And that's what organizations are now starting to develop.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's something that I've come across quite a lot. I mean, it's something that organizations have always really done in large scale transformation programs, setting up change agent networks. Because obviously, if you've got a company that's 50,000 employees globally, you've got one kind of central team, you can never understand all of the different cultures yourself. You can never understand the behaviors, the motivations, the ways of working. So that change agent network you just can't not have it. But I suppose now it's becoming more of a permanent thing. That when that change needs to be delivered, people are ready. It doesn't have to be done, as and when the transformation programs are being kicked off, basically. So no, that's a really, really good point. So, I mean, what
I'm starting to see that flow through into job descriptions. I wonder if you are as well, which is, I was looking at a job description for a change manager role today, and the expectation is that you will not only be sort of planning, managing, I think it was delivering and implementing were the 4 words they used for this change, but that you are also a part of skills and knowledge transfer, skills and capability building in the network of those impacted by change. And the fact that that was actually being called out quite specifically as part of your job means that now, if you're involved in change, you can't just be managing the change. You also need to be enthusing your stakeholders, perhaps helping them understand the life cycle of change, the emotional impact of change, while people resist change, how to motivate people through change. So you actually have to be part trainer, part deliverer now. So I'm starting to see that the role is widening. Would you agree? You're starting to see that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, change agent networks are absolutely huge. I've certainly seen it appear in job specs nowadays, and I mean, a lot of organisations, as I say, are maturing their change management function now, like we're just speaking about. So, it's all about making that change stick. That's what's really important. That's what I'm hearing anyway. Is that setting up this change agent network means that whatever has been implemented, whatever you've brought those contractors in to do, and you've invested in doing, it's not going to stick unless you've got people on the ground who are continuously driving adoption and engagement on that until it just is the way of working. Obviously, especially with transformations, intangible kind of transformations like a cultural change, for example. It's not just right. Let's take this system out and let's put that in, because then you can kind of just remove access to the other system maybe, and people will use it. But with cultural changes and ways of working, it has to be something that's constantly reinforced. That's certainly what I'm finding anyway. So yeah. So
my work in the next few months is going to be all about the neuro hacks, the neuroscientific sort of tweaks that we can do that sustain behavioural change, because I think that's the next piece for those of us who are very experienced in change management. I think we're starting to see that that's the expectation on our shoulders, that we are very good at creating that sustainable behavioural change. So I think what excites me about change management is that it is a profession that continually evolves. And that I think we owe in part our life cycle to project management from many years ago, but I think we're now starting to see that where our special space is in how we get into the heads of those that we're asking to work differently. So I think that the whole piece around neuroscience and behavioral economics and the psychology of change is just a huge sort of an amazingly interesting thing that we're doing, and I'm finding in my capability building work that a lot of what I'm spending my time doing is talking through the tips, the tricks, the techniques that help people go, oh, I get it, or oh, okay, I'll give that a go. I'm willing to give that a go. So there's that moment of clarity or that enthusiasm for getting involved in the change. That's when I know I've been successful. And that's what I need to replicate around 40,000, 60,000, 80,000 staff around the world. So that, I think, is the next big area of development. I think we're only just at the start of that, but it's an interesting one.
Just scratching the surface. Yeah, I mean, as you mentioned, I still see a lot of organisations these days that are very old school in the way that they do things, kind of merging change management and project management together. So obviously, we'll see a lot of project managers apply to my change manager roles, for example. But obviously now, as you've mentioned, that the understanding of of people's behaviours, why they do things, why they think in certain ways is so much more advanced now. I actually read a book on neuroscience for organisational change by Hilary Scarlett a couple of months back now, and that just completely revolutionised the way that I viewed change. I had no idea about what I was recruiting for until I kind of read that book, and it just goes right back to the kind of primal nature of human instinct in terms of why people act in certain ways, really. So yeah, absolutely. I'm seeing a lot more talk about kind of psychology and neuroscience and the applications to change management, and that's why I think that change management is taking off as its own discipline in its own right in such a big way at the moment.
And I think this is why when we're looking for brilliant change managers. I think one of the key things that we're looking for is that there's a real curiosity about people, because actually what you've just described is how do we make change happen? It goes down to how does the brain work? And if you've got a curiosity about building relationships, engaging with people, building trust, empathy, walking in their shoes, and wanting to curate the message you put across so that it's most impactful, those are an awful lot of sort of relationship building skills that I think that are held by those that sort of are real exemplars in our profession, those that can really make the difference. But I would say that also, coming from the world of project and program management, if that is your base start, I think you can still have an incredibly successful career in change, because the other part of what I'm looking for in a brilliant change manager is somebody who is incredibly organized, because the volume of work that we do, which is an awful lot of encouraging conversations, remembering to contact that person or point that benefit out, requires you to sort of process a huge number of tasks on any given day. So I know from my own experience that I call on my program planning skills probably every single day to get through the workload and think, yeah, I can just about do this. And I do have a belief that, you know, the world of change management is a very broad church, and we welcome people who come from a corporate communications background, an HR and organizational design background, those of us who come from a project and program management background, those of us who come from a psychology background. We're all welcome because we've all got something to contribute. So I think it's quite hard to describe the best background for a change manager. What you have to concentrate on is, but what are you able to do?
Yeah, I mean, it's so difficult, isn't it, to kind of recruit change managers that are really good, because all of the skills, or a lot of the skills you look for and the qualities are very intangible. You know, it's people skills, it's stakeholder management, is, you know, does this person actually understand other people's mindsets and the way they think? Can they empathize? It's all kind of qualities that are difficult to interview a lot of the times, difficult to interview for. Whereas project management and you know, business analysis and all of the very much take this out, put that in. It is just that. So, you know, as long as they've done it before, it can work. But yeah, I mean, I suppose, you know, going back to, you know, having the project background and moving into the change, I suppose there's an element also of understanding the people that you're working with in a deeper way, and understanding the project management side of things, because at the end of the day, they're also stakeholders that you're going to have to manage as a change manager. So, you know, having worked in a role like that before, I can imagine that it would help to move into that.
In the Agile Change Agent course that I developed for APMG, we very deliberately tried to meet the needs of this broad church, because what we've done is we've put in one half of the course is sort of structural, and it talks about all of your planning skills, all of your ability to identify benefits, identify your stakeholders. And then we start to look at, yes, but now you've got all of that, how do you build relationships and creating supportive sort of working environments where people are prepared to take risks? And for me, that sort of just sums up that what you're looking for is both that sort of, there's sort of the structural piece alongside the behavioural piece, and the two actually have to meet together very, very well if you're going to be successful in making change happen.
The other thing I want to talk about, I think we kind of touched upon it earlier, in terms of, you know, the sense of urgency. I've been speaking to a lot of businesses recently. In fact, pretty much everyone I've spoken to has had an experience where in the last 5 months they've delivered more change than they have in the last 5 years. So we touched upon it earlier, in that obviously that's partly because there's this wider societal sense of urgency that's being created by you know, the media and everything that we're seeing online and all of that sort of stuff. Would you say that there's a way of, I was going to say replicating, but getting as close as possible to that sense of urgency to be able to deliver that change more quickly?
Well, I think coupled with the sense of urgency, I think that everybody's also had an experience of where leaders, and that's the hierarchical leader role within their organisation, have actually been far more present, have been far swifter with their decision making. and have been closer to making things happen. And I think that if I look at the ProSci report that comes out every year about what's needed for successful change management, every year, top of the pile of things that we look for is sponsor engagement. And I think that the last few months have just shown how incredibly powerful it is when senior leaders get engaged, because what they do is, instead of being passive and listening for progress and maybe making the old comment if progress isn't as fast as they'd like it to be, no, they've been hands-on. They've been in there. They've been driving the agenda. They've been championing the change around the business, all the things that we've always asked them to do. And that has cut through so many governance layers that you can't afford to make a decision. One of my friends is the CEO of an NHS trust. And he said to me, it was absolutely amazing that we made decisions about how we were going to repurpose certain wards, how we were going to set up so that we could allow visiting in some parts of the hospital, but no visiting in other parts of the hospital. He said, we just cut through everything that we normally do, where we have these ideas, but we then mull them over for weeks or months at a time and nothing really shifts. And he said, I got in there, he said, and I was making sure these things happened. And I've seen that in other organizations as well, where I can really see when the CEO is driving the change, that there is real productivity, there's real pace behind it, and other places where perhaps the changes are still going through their governance layers, and that for every sort of decision making layer almost, you lose motivation, you lose impetus. So I think it's not just the rationale, the sense of urgency rationale, but it's also how a change is organized. And this also goes to the heart of, where is change management placed in the organization? You referred to it earlier as, often we're aligned with project and program management, but what we really are doing, if you're talking about a transformation agenda, what you're doing is you're actually the function that delivers on the strategic ambition of the organization, and therefore we need a seat at that table. And I think that's one of the ongoing sort of issues with change, is that perhaps we're not at that level. I'm very lucky, but I think I'm quite rare, that I spend my time genuinely in the boardroom, having the conversation about the impact of changes, how the changes are going to be managed, how they're going to be owned and sponsored. And I am at that table and I'm talking about change management as a risk mitigation activity. But I think that's quite rare. But I think that if there's any lasting change to be done, it's a recognition for senior leaders to reflect and go, how did we survive? How did we make all these changes happen? Oh, I was quite involved in that. My direct reports were actually quite involved in that. Maybe that is the secret sauce. And maybe that's the thing that we have to talk more about.
Absolutely. And I mean, I've certainly seen that, when there's all of those different governance layers, as you've said, and all of that red tape to get to, every layer that you go through, it's another conversation, and therefore it's another stakeholder's opinion, and it's another person that wants to do something slightly differently. And that's why it can always take quite a lot of time to get a strategy nailed down to the point that, a business is ready to say, right, let's actually kick this off now. Whereas, the change that we've seen just in the world in general is just crazy. Like in train stations, you've got hand sanitizer stations everywhere. I mean, that's a massive change program in itself. Just putting hand sanitizer things everywhere in every station within the space of weeks. That's no mean feat in itself. So, it's certainly, a case of having that decision maker directly saying, let's do this, let's do it this way. And not having to go through all of that red tape. So yeah, I think that's a really good point. So businesses, I've found as well, are often quite hesitant to change, because once they do commit to that change, it can be hard to go back. And obviously, when a business is kind of investing quite a lot of money in transforming something, it can be quite worrying. So what would you say businesses can do to kind of mitigate that risk of a program going wrong before actually investing all of that money?
Well, I think that the word agile is often used in all sorts of different ways. But I think that what we need to start looking at is that we don't do the sort of almost the drop dead approach, which is that what we do is debate all of the potential requirements, how we might do something, look at the totality of the investment up front, and then decide, are we going to leap off the cliff? Because the world doesn't really respond too well to that way of working at the moment, because there is so much change. You know, the old Department of Defense in the US in the 1980s came up with this idea of VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. Never was there a true set of words to describe where we are now. And so I think there is that this idea, or if you want a more academic reference, Dr. Peter Senge was writing similar things in the 1990s, which is start small, don't plan everything up front, put something into operation and get the feedback, get the genuine live experience of how do people react to it. Because otherwise what you're doing is you might be making a judgment call. I think our customers would love this. I absolutely think that this would cut our costs by 40%. But you've no evidence on that at all. And I think the thing is that you can go through those governance layers and everybody shares their opinion, but I'm just screaming, where's the evidence? Give me an example. So just cut projects down to the earliest possible worked example that you can create. You can call it a pilot, a prototype, an example, an early implementation. I don't care what you call it, but can we try a little bit of it? I'm having to build, I can't say much about what I'm doing, but I'm having to build a massive new organization, starting sort of now, and I know that there's some early launches planned around October time. And the one thing I keep saying is that, oh, for heaven's sake, let's just do a little bit and see how it works. Let's bring some people on board. Let's do a little bit of work. And if it goes well, because we think it will, we've got fantastic business case, but add a little bit more to it and then add a little bit more. You don't have to go right out the gate with completely fully formed from the get-go. And I think actually the way the world and the 21st century, the way the 21st century is played out, I think that that's actually incredibly naive to believe that you can do a whole load of work back in the office, package something together and go to your customers, hey, we've done this for you. And for them to go, oh, I'm so grateful. This is wonderful. Surely we should do a little bit, work with the customers to see what their feedback is, see what their reaction is. And based on that, be prepared to maybe change our journey, depending on what their feedback is, because they really are the ones that count. What scares me is how few organizations and perhaps are grasping that. They're sitting there debating the potential pros and cons. And I'm going, potential or hypothetical is different to actual. Put a little bit of your idea into use, put it into operation, implement it, and then find out what the real reaction is. And you can then scale it or stop it. You know, those are your choices. Whereas if you don't, you've the third choice is you don't stop it, you don't scale it. Because why? Because you've gone for a full scale implementation, costing God knows how much money and taking up so much time. So I think we just have to be, I think it's a huge change of mindset. It has to reflect the fact that the world has changed. And maybe this is the moment to step back and go, actually, there's lots of evidence that the world has changed. And maybe this is the time to rethink how we do stuff around here.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suppose, with that agile approach, you're gonna lose out a lot less if something like COVID happens, for example. If something happens that just changes everything. You can never anticipate something like that, but at least adopting that agile approach can kind of mitigate that loss, and you haven't invested everything all at once. But with agile, I mean, I certainly in the last year even, I've noticed agile in change management as a discipline really, really kind of taking off. No doubt, thanks to you and your course, Melanie. But I mean, previous to that, it was very much associated with projects, as in, we'll release this part of the system, or we'll release this small application and see if that works. But you've also applied that to the change as well now, which I think is really important too. So I mean, just going back to then the kind of central change management function of an organization. To kind of close out, what advice would you give to organizations who want to mature their change management capability and make it sustainable?
I think that what you want to employ are people who not only really understand change management, but perhaps have a passion for sharing their passion with others, that they have a commitment to building the skill set across a wide range of roles. And I think this is a conversation I've had with an awful lot of practitioners recently, is that your job is twofold. You've got to take certain changes and make sure that they are pushed through in a way that we would normally see, that our skill set is required. But at the same time, are you also, with every single opportunity, role modeling, and it also taking the time to explain, how did you do that? So if you do the stakeholder analysis, or if you do the impact assessment, or if you do a readiness assessment, are you able to explain how you do that, why you do it, what results you're expecting to others? So are you constantly looking for a group of people that you can upskill? Because I think if that's what I'm looking for when it comes to building a change management capability, it's about I'm going to lead by example. But the key thing is I'm going to lead others to do the same thing so that I can then move off and do something else. But I think it's that, how do you replicate and build out your capability to others within the organization?
Yeah, no, that's really good. Melanie, I cannot thank you enough for coming on the podcast. It's been absolutely fantastic to have you on. I think we've discussed some really interesting topics and topics that are really hot at the moment. So I'm absolutely, I'm positive this is going to help a lot of people in our network to get their transformations delivered. Not only that, but to make it stick as well within the organisation. So don't forget to build your change agent networks, everyone. It's very important, and just build that capability so that when you leave, it's still there. So Melanie, it's been an absolute pleasure. Again, can't thank you enough. Hopefully we'll do it again at some point as well. Yeah, and that's it. So do tune in to the next month podcast as well. Every episode is going to be uploaded at the end of each month. So I've got a really exciting guest for next month as well, to be announced nearer the time. But Melanie, thank you and have a lovely week.
Very much. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks.